I'm Wendy Kraft, 22, and I graduated on merit after years of piecing together part-time work and small scholarships. For years, I shouldered my family's money troubles, trusted their decisions, and let them manage every dollar. But when my billionaire uncle hugged me at graduation and asked if the $700,000 education fund he'd set up covered everything, and I said, "What fund?" I chose truth over family comfort. Ever been minimized or blindsided by someone you backed without question? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and self-worth. What happened next might surprise you. The conversation ended without resolution, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. They could no longer count on my compliance or my gratitude. I'd learned too much to return to the comfortable ignorance that had made their deception possible, and I was no longer willing to prioritize their comfort over my own need for truth. I called Uncle Richard that evening. His voice when he answered carried no surprise. He'd been expecting to hear from me, waiting to see whether I'd choose loyalty to the people who raised me or loyalty to the truth they'd hidden. "I need to know everything," I told him. "All of it. From the beginning." He sighed, the sound of someone who'd hoped this conversation could be avoided, but knew it was inevitable. "Are you sure? Once you know the full scope of what happened, you can't unknow it. Your relationship with your parents will never be the same." I thought about that warning, understanding its weight. But my relationship with my parents had already been irreparably changed by what I'd learned at graduation. The only question now was whether it would be damaged by partial truth or complete truth. "I'm sure." We arranged to meet the following day at his office, a neutral location where we could talk without interruption or oversight. The building was downtown, sleek and modern, with the kind of understated luxury that spoke to serious money managed by serious people. Uncle Richard's office reflected his personality, elegant but not ostentatious, expensive but not flashy. He gestured for me to take a seat across from his desk, then pulled out a file folder that looked thick enough to contain a considerable amount of documentation. "5 years ago," he began, "I established a trust fund specifically for your education. $700,000, invested conservatively to ensure it would grow modestly while remaining accessible when needed." He opened the folder and showed me paperwork I'd never seen before: legal documents establishing the trust, investment statements showing steady growth, correspondence with financial institutions about management and oversight. The terms were specific, he continued. The money was to be used exclusively for educational expenses, tuition, room and board, books, reasonable living costs during college. Your parents were designated as trustees, with authority to make distributions on your behalf. I studied the documents, seeing my name throughout the legal language, seeing references to my education and my future that had been written when I was 13 years old. Uncle Richard had been planning for my success while I was still figuring out high school algebra. "There was one other important condition," he said. "You were supposed to be informed about the trust during your senior year of high school, in time to make informed decisions about college applications and financial planning." The timeline made perfect sense. Senior year was when students received college acceptance letters, when final decisions about financing needed to be made, when the real costs of higher education became concrete rather than abstract. It was exactly when knowledge about when-dealable resources would be most valuable. "I started asking questions last fall when I realized you weren't applying to schools that should have been obvious choices given your academic record," Uncle Richard said. "When I asked about the scholarship programs I'd heard about, your parents assured me you were aware of all your options." I remembered those conversations, how my parents had quickly redirected discussions about college choices towards safer topics. They'd been managing information flow carefully, keeping Uncle Richard satisfied that I was being properly informed while ensuring I remained ignorant about the resources when dealable to me. "The military scholarship I mentioned at graduation was my mistake," he admitted. "I'd misremembered some details about how the trust was structured. But when you had no idea what I was talking about, I realized something was seriously wrong." He showed me bank statements and transaction records, documenting the steady depletion of the trust fund over the past 3 years. Withdrawals had been made regularly, always for amounts just below the threshold that would trigger additional oversight or notification requirements. They were careful, Uncle Richard said, his voice carrying a note of grudging professional respect. Never took so much at once that it would raise immediate red flags. Always provided documentation that could plausibly justify the expenditures as educational or family-related expenses. The paper trail told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate family financial management. Home renovation costs had been classified as creating a better study environment for me. Vacation expenses had been justified as educational travel. My mother's medical bills had been paid from the trust, despite the fact that insurance coverage and their own resources should have been sufficient. "How much is left?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "About $15,000, Uncle Richard said. Enough to cover your first semester textbooks, if you're careful about buying used copies." The scope of their betrayal was staggering. They'd stolen nearly $700,000 from their own daughter, money that had been specifically set aside to ensure I could pursue any educational opportunity one wanted without financial constraint. They'd done this while simultaneously constructing an elaborate performance about their own sacrifices and financial struggles. "What happens now?" I asked. Uncle Richard's expression hardened. "Now I have a decision to make about how to handle people who stole money from a trust account and lied about it for years. If they weren't family, this would be a straightforward case of embezzlement and fraud. The legal implications hadn't occurred to me, but they were obvious once stated. My parents hadn't just betrayed family trust, they'd committed actual crimes. Fiduciary responsibility, breach of trust, possibly wire fraud if any of the transactions had crossed state lines. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same careful attention he'd paid to financial documents. "That depends on what kind of person you want to be and what kind of family you want to have going forward." The choice he was offering was between justice and family harmony, between holding people accountable for their actions and maintaining relationships that could never again be based on genuine trust. It was the kind of decision that would define not just my immediate future, but the kind of adult I became. I thought about my parents at home, probably sitting in the same living room where we'd had our confrontation, wondering whether their daughter would choose them or choose the truth. I thought about graduations and celebrations, about the years of manipulation disguised as care, about scholarship essays I'd written describing financial hardships that had never actually existed. "I want them held accountable," I said. "Whatever that looks like, whatever the consequences are." They made their choices. Now they can live with the results. Uncle Richard nodded, as if he'd expected this response, but wanted to hear it stated clearly. "Once this starts, it's going to get ugly quickly. They'll blame you for destroying the family. They'll tell everyone who'll listen that you chose money over loyalty." I considered that prospect, the inevitable fallout that would come from choosing truth over comfort. But the alternative, pretending nothing had happened, allowing them to escape consequences for stealing my future, felt like betraying myself in ways that would echo for decades. "Let them blame me," I said. "At least I'll know I'm not protecting people who treated me like a mark in their own con game." Uncle Richard began making phone calls that afternoon. Lawyers, accountants, investigators, professionals who specialized in untangling financial deceptions and holding people accountable for breaches of fiduciary responsibility. Within 48 hours, my parents received formal legal notification that their management of the trust was under investigation. The reaction was swift and predictable. My father called me at work, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "How could you do this to us? After everything we've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay us." The irony was breathtaking. They'd stolen money designated for my education, lied to me for years about our financial situation, and manipulated my college planning process to cover their tracks. But in their minds, I was the one betraying family loyalty by insisting on honesty and accountability. "You've destroyed this family," my mother said when I came home that evening. She was standing in the kitchen, her face streaked with tears, holding legal documents like evidence of my cruelty. "Your own parents. We loved you, we provided for you, we gave you everything we could." I looked around the kitchen, seeing it with new eyes. The appliances that had been upgraded with money stolen from my education fund. The countertops that had been renovated while I worked part-time jobs to contribute to college costs that should never have existed. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle they'd maintained while constructing elaborate stories about financial struggle. You gave me lies, I said. You gave me guilt about expenses that didn't exist and gratitude for sacrifices that were never made. You gave me a completely false understanding of our family's situation so you could steal money that wasn't yours. They wanted me to feel sorry for them, to prioritize their comfort over the consequences of their own choices. But I'd spent too many years feeling grateful for manipulations disguised as care. Their tears didn't change what they'd done, and their disappointment in me didn't alter the facts Uncle Richard's investigation was uncovering. The legal process unfolded with methodical precision. Bank records were subpoenaed, transaction histories were analyzed, documentation was compared against the terms of the trust agreement. Every withdrawal, every expenditure, every justification my parents had provided was scrutinized by professionals who specialized in detecting financial fraud. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Over 3 years, my parents had systematically diverted nearly $700,000 from an account designated specifically for my education. They'd used false documentation, misleading expense reports, and outright lies to cover their theft. The paper trail revealed a pattern of deception that went far beyond simple family financial management. Uncle Richard's lawyers presented my parents with a choice: full restitution plus penalties, or criminal prosecution for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. The threat of jail time concentrated their minds wonderfully, forcing them to confront the reality that their actions had legal consequences that extended beyond family drama. They tried negotiating, pleading, making appeals to family loyalty and shared history. But Uncle Richard's response was inflexible: return the money or face prosecution. There were no alternatives, no middle grounds, no opportunities for partial accountability. The restitution process required them to liquidate assets, sell property, and essentially dismantle the comfortable lifestyle they'd built using stolen money. Their house went on the market, their investment accounts were emptied, their retirement plans were sacrificed to repay debts they'd created through their own choices. Extended family members began taking sides, some supporting my parents and others recognizing that financial crimes couldn't be ignored simply because they occurred within families. Holiday gatherings became battlegrounds, with relatives arguing about loyalty versus accountability, family harmony versus justice. I watched it all with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness because the family I'd grown up in was disintegrating, because relationships I'd valued were being destroyed by revelations I could no longer ignore. Satisfaction because people were finally being held accountable for actions they'd taken in secret, because consequences were finally matching choices. My parents' friends, the people they'd bragged to for years about their sacrifices and their daughter's achievements, began distancing themselves as the full scope of the deception became clear. The narrative they'd constructed about struggling parents supporting their child's dreams collapsed under the weight of documented evidence about stolen trust funds and fabricated financial hardships. The social cost of their choices extended far beyond legal penalties. They'd built their reputation on lies that were now being exposed publicly, creating embarrassment that would follow them for years. People who'd admired their supposed sacrifices now saw them as thieves who'd stolen from their own daughter. 6 months after graduation day, Uncle Richard presented me with a restored trust fund, slightly smaller than the original due to legal fees and recovery costs, but sufficient to cover any educational expenses I might have. The money came with new management terms, new oversight provisions, and new trustees who had no personal interest in diverting funds for other purposes. "This should have been yours all along," he said, handing me account statements that showed my name as the sole beneficiary. "I'm sorry it took so long to get it back where it belonged." I stared at the numbers, seeing my future transformed once again. Graduate school, professional programs, international study opportunities, all of it was suddenly possible in ways I'd never imagined during high school. The restrictions my parents had imposed through their lies had been lifted, revealing possibilities they'd hidden from me for years. But the victory felt complicated. I had my money back, my parents were being held accountable, and the truth about my family's finances was finally exposed. Justice had been served in the most complete way possible. Yet the cost had been the destruction of relationships that had shaped my entire life, even if those relationships had been built on foundations of deception. My parents remained unrepentant, convinced that they were victims of my disloyalty rather than architects of their own downfall. They'd lost their house, their savings, their reputation, and their relationship with their only child, but they maintained that they'd been trying to help the family through difficult times, and that my reaction was disproportionate to their mistakes. The gap between their perception and reality was too wide to bridge. They saw themselves as well-intentioned parents who'd made some questionable financial decisions. I saw them as people who'd stolen my future and lied about it for years, forcing me to adjust my dreams to accommodate crimes I'd never been told were being committed. The estrangement settled into a pattern of careful distance. We maintained minimal contact out of necessity, legal paperwork that required signatures, insurance matters that involved family coverage, the occasional holiday text message that acknowledged shared history without pretending current warmth. But the easy intimacy that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by the formal politeness reserved for people whose trustworthiness has been permanently compromised. Uncle Richard became an unexpected source of support during this transition. His interest in my welfare had always seemed genuine, but I'd never fully understood the depth of his commitment to my success. The trust fund he'd established wasn't just financial generosity, it was a carefully planned investment in my future, designed to provide opportunities regardless of what decisions my parents might make about supporting my education. I suspected something wasn't right, he told me during one of our regular dinners. Your parents were always vague when I asked about your college planning, always deflecting when I offered to help with specific expenses. But I hoped I was being paranoid. His intuition had been correct, but family loyalty had constrained his ability to investigate more aggressively until the graduation day revelation made further discretion impossible. The confrontation that had shattered my world had been building for months, as he'd noticed inconsistencies in my parents' explanations and gaps in my knowledge about when-dealable resources. Trust isn't automatic, he said. Even with family. Especially with family, sometimes. People who have access to your resources also have the greatest opportunity to abuse that access. It was a hard lesson, but one that felt essential for navigating future relationships. The assumption that shared blood created shared interests had been thoroughly disproven by my parents' willingness to steal from their own daughter. Uncle Richard's approach, formal agreements, clear oversight, documented accountability, offered a template for maintaining relationships without creating opportunities for exploitation. My college experience unfolded differently than it would have under my parents' financial management. Instead of limiting myself to state schools and scholarship opportunities, I could consider programs based on their quality and fit with my career goals. The artificial constraints that had shaped my high school planning were gone, replaced by genuine choice about how to invest in my education. The psychological shift was as significant as the financial one. For years, I'd carried guilt about the supposed burden my education placed on my family, gratitude for sacrifices I'd believed my parents were making, anxiety about justifying expenses they claimed were stretching our resources to the breaking point. All of that emotional weight disappeared when I learned the truth about our actual financial situation. I chose a prestigious private university, one of the schools I'd been encouraged to dismiss as unrealistic during my senior year of high school. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had discouraged me from applying to expensive schools while sitting on more than enough money to cover any educational costs I might incur anywhere I might want to study. The transition to college felt like stepping into a life that should have been mine all along. I wasn't working part-time jobs to offset expenses, wasn't limiting my course selections based on financial concerns, wasn't carrying the weight of family sacrifice that had shaped so many decisions during high school. For the first time, I could focus entirely on academics and personal growth without the distraction of artificial financial constraints. My parents made occasional attempts to reestablish contact, usually through relatives who thought family harmony was more important than accountability. Aunts and cousins would call with updates about how difficult the situation had become, how much my parents missed me, how healing the family required forgiveness from all parties. These mediators meant well, but they misunderstood the fundamental nature of what had happened. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through compromise and mutual apologies. It was a case of criminal behavior that had been exposed, prosecuted, and punished according to legal and ethical standards that existed independently of family preferences. They made mistakes, my aunt said during one particularly persistent reconciliation attempt. But they're still your parents. Don't you think you've punished them enough? The question revealed a common misunderstanding about accountability and consequences. I hadn't punished my parents. I'd simply refused to protect them from the results of their own choices. The legal system had punished them. The social consequences had punished them. Their loss of reputation, financial stability, and family relationships were natural outcomes of their behavior, not retribution I'd imposed. My refusal to minimize their crimes or pretend they hadn't happened wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary that protected my own integrity and prevented future exploitation. People who'd stolen from me once, lied to me for years, and shown no genuine remorse for their actions couldn't be trusted with access to my life or resources again. Uncle Richard supported this position without reservation. Forgiveness doesn't require putting yourself back in position to be victimized again, he said. You can wish them well without giving them opportunities to repeat their behavior. His perspective reflected hard-won wisdom about family relationships and financial boundaries. He'd seen too many cases where misplaced loyalty enabled ongoing exploitation, where people prioritized family harmony over personal protection and suffered predictable consequences. The college years passed with steady progress toward goals that had once seemed impossibly distant. Graduate school became a realistic option. Professional opportunities opened up that would have been foreclosed by the financial limitations my parents had artificially imposed. The life I was building bore no resemblance to the constrained future they'd envisioned for me. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about their situation through family networks. They'd moved to a smaller apartment after losing the house, taken jobs that barely covered their basic living expenses, struggled with the financial and social consequences of their choices for years after the initial legal settlement. These reports were meant to evoke sympathy, to make me feel guilty for allowing their situation to deteriorate so completely. But I'd learned to separate their consequences from my emotions, to recognize that their suffering was the result of their actions rather than my reactions. They'd chosen to steal money that wasn't theirs. They'd chosen to lie about it for years. They'd chosen to manipulate my understanding of our family's financial situation to cover their tracks. They'd chosen to prioritize their immediate desires over my long-term interests, their comfort over my trust, their convenience over my opportunities. Every difficulty they faced afterward flowed directly from those choices. I'd simply refused to shield them from reality, declined to sacrifice my own interests to preserve illusions that had never served me, rejected the idea that family loyalty required enabling criminal behavior. The path they'd taken had been entirely their own. The destination they'd reached was exactly where those choices led. Time has a way of clarifying perspectives that seem complicated in the moment. 5 years after graduation day, I can look back at the destruction of my family relationships with something approaching equanimity. The sadness remains. I genuinely loved the people who raised me, believed in the stories they told about our life together, trusted them to act in my best interests even when those interests conflicted with their desires. But the sadness is clean now, uncomplicated by guilt or regret about my own choices. I'd responded to betrayal with honesty, to theft with accountability, to manipulation with boundaries. The consequences that followed weren't punishments I'd imposed, but natural results of actions my parents had taken freely and secretly for years. Uncle Richard and I developed a relationship based on the principles he'd tried to teach me during those early conversations about trust and verification. We meet regularly, discuss my career progress and his business interests, maintain the kind of straightforward communication that becomes possible when both parties understand that affection doesn't eliminate the need for clear agreements and honest accounting. He never pressured me to reconcile with my parents, never suggested that family harmony was more important than personal integrity. His own experience with family financial arrangements had taught him that good intentions without proper oversight created opportunities for abuse. That trust without verification was simply naivety dressed up in emotional language. "You did the right thing," he told me recently over dinner. "It took courage to choose truth over comfort, accountability over family peace. A lot of people wouldn't have been strong enough to make that choice." I appreciate his support, but I've come to understand that I didn't really have alternatives. Once I learned what my parents had done, once I understood the scope of their deception and the impact on my life, maintaining the illusion of normal family relationships would have required betraying myself in ways that felt impossible. The person I became through this experience, more cautious about trust, more insistent on transparency, more willing to enforce boundaries even when enforcement creates conflict. That person couldn't have pretended that theft and lies were acceptable within families while being unacceptable everywhere else. My parents and I still exist in each other's lives in the most minimal way possible. We exchange Christmas cards with generic messages, acknowledge each other's birthdays with brief text messages, maintain the kind of distant courtesy that prevents complete estrangement while acknowledging that genuine relationship is no longer possible. They've never apologized in any meaningful way, never acknowledged that their actions were criminal rather than merely poor judgment, never shown understanding of how their choices affected my trust in relationships generally. Their version of events remains that they were trying to help the family through difficult times and that my reaction was disproportionate to their mistakes. This ongoing denial makes reconciliation impossible, but it also makes me confident that distance is the right choice. People who steal money and then reframe theft as family assistance, who lie for years and then characterize exposure as betrayal, who face legal consequences for criminal behavior and still see themselves as victims. Those people haven't learned anything that would prevent similar behavior in the future. My career has flourished in ways that wouldn't have been possible under the financial constraints my parents had tried to impose. Graduate school, professional development opportunities, networking events, travel for conferences and training. All the investments in human capital that open doors and create possibilities became undealable when I gained access to resources that should have been mine from the beginning. The life I've built looks nothing like the modest, constrained future my parents had envisioned for me during high school. Their attempts to limit my options by concealing undealable resources failed completely once the truth emerged, but the years of unnecessary limitation and artificial struggle left marks that persist even now. I'm more suspicious of people's motives, more insistent on documentation and verification, more alert to gaps between what people say and what they do. These aren't necessarily negative changes, they're protective adaptations that serve me well in professional and personal contexts where trust needs to be earned rather than assumed. But they're also barriers to the kind of easy intimacy that comes naturally to people who haven't learned to question the motives of those closest to them. I approach new relationships with wariness that some people find off-putting, maintain emotional distance that prevents the kind of vulnerability that deepens connections over time. Uncle Richard understands this tendency, having developed similar protective instincts through his own experiences with family financial arrangements. Trust is rebuilt slowly, he reminds me when I express frustration with my own caution. You'll know when you meet someone who deserves it. I hope he's right. The alternative, a life of permanent emotional distance, relationships that never develop beyond careful cordiality, the inability to believe fully in anyone's good intentions, feels like allowing my parents' betrayal to continue damaging me long after they've lost the power to do direct harm. The money they stole has been replaced and invested wisely. The educational opportunities they tried to limit became undealable and were seized enthusiastically. The career prospects they would have constrained through their artificial limitations flourished once genuine choice became possible. But trust, once broken so thoroughly by the people who were supposed to protect and nurture it, proves harder to restore than financial accounts or professional opportunities. That may be the most lasting damage from their choices, not the money they took or the lies they told, but the wariness they created in someone who'd once believed that family love was sufficient protection against exploitation. Still, I sleep well at night. I built the life I wanted using resources that were rightfully mine, made decisions based on accurate information rather than manipulative fiction. succeeded according to standards that reflect my actual capabilities rather than artificial constraints imposed by people who'd stolen my opportunities while claiming to support them. The family I lost was built on lies that couldn't be sustained once exposed. The relationships that ended weren't based on mutual respect and honesty, but on my ignorance and their ability to manipulate that ignorance for their benefit. What was destroyed wasn't worth preserving, and what replaced it, a smaller circle of more trustworthy relationships, provides the kind of support that doesn't require deception to maintain. My parents chose their path when they decided to steal money intended for their daughter's future. Everything that followed was simply the natural consequence of that choice, playing out according to rules they understood but hoped they could avoid. They weren't victims of my intransigence or Uncle Richard's vindictiveness. They were people who'd committed crimes and discovered that family relationships don't provide immunity from accountability. I chose my path when I decided that truth was more important than family harmony, that accountability mattered more than peace, that my integrity was worth more than their comfort. The life that choice created may be more solitary than it might otherwise have been, but it's built on solid ground rather than the shifting foundation of lies and manipulation that had supported everything that came before. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's exactly what I deserved all along. I grew up in a house where money was always the elephant in the room. Not because we had too much of it, but because we supposedly had too little. Every conversation seemed to circle back to our financial struggles, every decision filtered through the lens of what we could or couldn't afford. My parents had perfected the art of the heavy sigh, the meaningful pause before explaining why something I wanted was simply out of reach. "We're doing everything we can to give you opportunities," my mother would say, her voice carrying that particular strain that suggested noble sacrifice. My father would nod gravely, adding details about overtime shifts and cut corners, painting a picture of two people stretching every dollar until it screamed. The only family member who seemed immune to our perpetual state of financial crisis was my uncle, my father's older brother. Where my parents drove aging sedans and clipped coupons, Uncle Richard moved through the world with the quiet confidence that money brings when you have enough of it. He wasn't flashy about his wealth, but you could see it in the details: the custom suits, the way restaurant staff treated him, the casual mention of business trips to places that sounded exotic to my teenage ears. His visits to our house were infrequent but memorable. He'd arrive in cars that looked like they'd rolled off showroom floors, carrying himself with an easy authority that made our cramped living room seem even smaller. My parents transformed around him, their usual complaints about bills and expenses temporarily shelved in favor of forced cheerfulness and careful conversation. "How's school going?" he'd ask me, and I'd tell him about my grades, my part-time job at the local grocery store, my plans for college. He listened with the kind of attention that made me feel important, asking follow-up questions that showed he remembered details from previous conversations. "Keep working hard," he'd say before leaving. "Education is the one thing no one can take away from you." My parents would beam with pride during these exchanges, steering the conversation toward my achievements whenever possible. They'd mention my honor roll status, my perfect attendance, how mature and responsible I was with my part-time job earnings. Uncle Richard would nod approvingly, sometimes reaching into his wallet to hand me a crisp $100 bill. "For something special," he'd say, waving away my protests. "Every hard-working student deserves a treat now and then." These moments felt like rays of sunlight breaking through clouds. For a brief time, the weight of our supposed financial burden would lift, replaced by the warm feeling that someone successful and important believed in me. My parents would remind me repeatedly how fortunate I was to have such a generous uncle, how important it was to make him proud of the family name. The message was clear: Uncle Richard was our connection to a better life, a reminder that success was possible even if it felt impossibly distant from our daily reality. My father would tell stories about their childhood, how Richard had always been the ambitious one, the brother who saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. "He started with nothing, just like us," my father would say. "But he had vision. He took risks. That's why he's where he is today." I absorbed these lessons about hard work and determination, applying them to my own life with the fervor of someone who believed effort alone could bridge any gap. I studied harder than my classmates, worked extra shifts at the grocery store, saved every penny I could toward my college fund. When scholarships became dealable, I applied for all of them, writing essays about overcoming financial hardship and the value of education. My parents praised these efforts while simultaneously reminding me how much they were sacrificing to support my dreams. They'd show me bills, talk about second mortgages and borrowed money, creating a narrative where my education was costing them everything they had. The weight of their sacrifice became part of my identity, a constant reminder that I owed them more than I could ever repay. Uncle Richard would ask about my college plans during his visits, nodding thoughtfully when I explained my scholarship applications and part-time work schedule. He seemed pleased by my determination to contribute financially, telling my parents they should be proud of raising such a responsible daughter. Most kids her age expect everything handed to them, he'd say. But she understands the value of earning her way. These conversations reinforced the family mythology we'd constructed, that I was fortunate to have parents who prioritized my education despite their limited means, and lucky to have an uncle who took genuine interest in my success. The narrative felt solid, unquestionable. I was the grateful daughter of struggling but devoted parents, working hard to make the most of the opportunities their sacrifices had created. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they managed these interactions. Uncle Richard never stayed long enough for detailed conversations about specifics. My parents controlled the flow of information, presenting a version of our circumstances that painted them as heroes of their own story. I was too young and too trusting to question the gaps in what I was being told. The summer before my senior year of high school, Uncle Richard visited more frequently than usual. He'd ask pointed questions about my college choices, my major, whether I'd received responses from scholarship committees. His interest felt more intense, more focused than it had in previous years. "Have you heard anything about that military scholarship program?" he asked during one visit, a question that struck me as oddly specific. "I don't think I applied for anything military-related," I told him. "Most of my applications are for academic merit scholarships." He nodded thoughtfully, but didn't pursue the topic further. My parents changed the subject quickly, steering the conversation toward my recent achievement as valedictorian. But something in the air had shifted, a tension I couldn't quite identify. That feeling would prove prophetic. The foundation of everything I believed about my family, about my circumstances, about the sacrifices being made for my future, all of it was about to crumble in the space of a single conversation on what should have been the proudest day of my life. I graduated with highest honors, ready to take on the world with the confidence that comes from earning your way through honest effort. I had no idea that the ground beneath my feet was already shifting, that the truth waiting for me would redefine everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me and the uncle who had quietly watched over my progress from a distance. The warning signs had been there all along, but I was too close to the situation to recognize them for what they were. College preparation brought new layers of financial stress to our household, or at least that's how my parents presented it. They'd sit at the kitchen table with stacks of papers, whispering in urgent tones about tuition costs and living expenses, occasionally throwing out numbers that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "State school is really our only option," my mother would say, her voice heavy with resignation. "Even with scholarships, the private colleges are just too expensive." I'd accepted this reality without question, adjusting my expectations accordingly. When acceptance letters arrived from schools I'd dreamed of attending, my parents would examine them with the kind of careful scrutiny usually reserved for legal documents. They'd focus immediately on the financial aid packages, comparing numbers and shaking their heads at what they deemed insufficient support. "Look at this," my father would say, pointing at figures that meant nothing to me. Even with their so-called generous aid package, we'd still be looking at $40,000 a year out of pocket. There's just no way. I learned not to push back on these assessments. When I'd suggest taking out additional student loans or finding more part-time work, they'd explain patiently why such solutions were unrealistic or dangerous. They painted themselves as protective parents shielding me from financial burdens that could cripple my future, making decisions based on wisdom and experience I couldn't yet understand. But certain details didn't quite fit the narrative they'd constructed. Our house might have been modest, but it was well-maintained and comfortable. We took family vacations every summer, nothing extravagant, but more than many families in genuinely difficult financial situations could afford. My parents drove older cars, but they were reliable, and when major repairs were needed, the money seemed to appear without the dramatic crisis I'd expect from truly cash-strapped people. More puzzling were the conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. I'd catch fragments of discussions about accounts and transfers, words that seemed at odds with their constant emphasis on our tight budget. When I asked direct questions about our finances, hoping to understand how I could contribute more effectively to my college fund, they'd deflect with vague answers about adult responsibilities I wasn't ready to handle. "You don't need to worry about the details," my mother would say. "Your job is to focus on your studies and let us handle the money side of things." This arrangement felt reasonable at the time. I was 17 years old, working part-time, maintaining a perfect GPA, and applying for every scholarship opportunity one could find. My parents seemed competent and caring, if somewhat stressed by the financial pressures of supporting my educational ambitions. I trusted their judgment about what we could and couldn't afford. Uncle Richard's visits during this period took on a different quality. He'd ask more detailed questions about my college search, wanting to know which schools I was considering and why. When I'd explain that we were limiting options based on cost, he'd listen with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and concern. "Money shouldn't be the only factor in choosing a college," he'd say carefully. "Sometimes the investment in a better education pays for itself in the long run." My parents would nod politely but maintain their position about practical limitations and responsible decision-making. They'd steer conversations away from specific dollar amounts, keeping discussions general and philosophical rather than allowing Uncle Richard to delve into the actual numbers involved in my college planning. These interactions left me with a vague sense of missed connections, as if important information was being communicated in a language I didn't speak. Uncle Richard seemed to want to offer more concrete help, but my parents maintained careful control over these conversations, positioning themselves as the gatekeepers of all decisions related to my future. The scholarship applications became another source of confusion. I'd spent months researching opportunities and crafting essays, applying for everything from academic merit awards to need-based grants. My parents helped with some of the paperwork, particularly anything requiring detailed financial information they insisted I wasn't qualified to handle. "These forms are incredibly complicated," my father would explain. "One mistake could disqualify you entirely. Better to let us handle the technical parts." I'd receive acknowledgement letters for various applications, but the follow-up communications seemed to bypass me entirely. When I asked about status updates or award notifications, my parents would give vague responses about processing delays and administrative complications. They assured me that everything was being handled properly, that I'd be informed immediately if any significant funding became undealable. The pattern of information control extended to other areas of college preparation. I wasn't allowed to see actual tuition bills or financial aid communications from schools. My parents insisted this was to protect me from unnecessary stress, that they were managing all the administrative details so I could concentrate on finishing high school strong. "Senior year is challenging enough without worrying about bureaucratic paperwork," my mother would say. "We want you to enjoy these last few months before everything changes." This protectiveness felt caring at the time, evidence of parents who understood the pressures I was facing and wanted to shield me from additional burdens. I appreciated their willingness to handle the complicated adult responsibilities while I focused on academics and college preparation. But the boundaries they'd established around financial information created blind spots in my understanding of our actual situation. I knew we were struggling, but I didn't know the specifics. I knew college would be expensive, but I didn't know exactly how expensive or what resources we had available to cover those costs. I knew my parents were making sacrifices, but I didn't know what those sacrifices actually entailed. Uncle Richard's behavior during this period makes more sense in hindsight. His questions weren't casual family interest, they were fact-finding missions, attempts to understand whether the assistance he'd provided was reaching its intended destination. But I was too naive to recognize the investigation happening around me, too trusting to question why the adults in my life seemed to be operating with different sets of information. The truth was preparing to surface, gathering momentum like an Wendy Lanch waiting for the right trigger to bring everything crashing down. Graduation day arrived with all the ceremony and celebration such milestones deserve. I'd worked 4 years for this moment, maintaining perfect grades while balancing part-time jobs and college preparations. The morning felt electric with possibility, that particular energy that comes when one chapter of life is ending and another is about to begin. My parents were beaming with pride as we gathered for photographs before the ceremony. They'd invited extended family, including aunts and cousins I rarely saw, creating the kind of festive atmosphere that makes important days feel even more significant. Everyone wanted pictures, everyone had congratulations and predictions about my bright future ahead. Uncle Richard's presence was unexpected. He rarely attended family gatherings, and I couldn't remember him ever coming to school events before. But there he was, impeccably dressed as always, carrying himself with that quiet authority that made him impossible to ignore. His attendance elevated the entire occasion, transforming my graduation from a family celebration into something that felt more important, more witnessed. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of speeches and processionals, the kind of formal ritual that feels simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. When my name was called, I walked across that stage with the confidence of someone who'd earned every step through honest effort. My parents cheered from the audience, their pride visible even from a distance. Afterward, as families clustered in small groups for more photographs and final conversations, Uncle Richard approached me directly. This was unusual. Typically, he'd speak with my parents first, observing the family hierarchy before engaging with me personally. But today he bypassed protocol entirely, walking up to me with something that looked almost like urgency. "Congratulations," he said, pulling me into an embrace that felt warmer and more genuine than his usual reserved demeanor. "I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." I thanked him, feeling that familiar flutter of validation that came with his approval. But instead of the typical brief conversation about my future plans, he held my attention with an intensity that felt different from our previous interactions. "So," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, "did the military scholarship I funded cover everything?" The question hit me like cold water. I stared at him, processing words that made no sense in the context of anything I knew about my education or my funding. Military scholarship? Funded by him? I'd applied for dozens of scholarships over the past 2 years, but none of them had been military-related, and certainly none of them had involved Uncle Richard directly. "What scholarship?" I asked, my voice smaller than I'd intended. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. The warmth and pride disappeared, replaced by something harder, more focused. His eyes moved from my face to something behind me, and I realized my parents had been standing close enough to hear our entire conversation. When I turned to look at them, their faces had gone completely white. My father's mouth was slightly open, as if he'd been caught mid-breath and forgotten how to exhale. My mother's hands were clenched at her sides, her entire body rigid with what looked like terror. Uncle Richard's voice, when he spoke again, had dropped to a tone I'd never heard from him before, quiet, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained rage. "Then who," he said, spacing each word with deliberate precision, "took the 700,000? The number hung in the air like something physical, too large and incomprehensible to process immediately. $700,000. A sum so far beyond anything I'd ever contemplated that it felt abstract, like a figure from someone else's life entirely. The celebration around us continued, other families still taking pictures, graduates still accepting congratulations, but our small group had become an island of sudden, terrible tension. People nearby seemed to sense that something was wrong, their conversations becoming quieter, their glances more frequent and curious. My parents tried to speak, their voices overlapping in a stammered attempt at explanation. But Uncle Richard wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at me, his expression shifting from anger to something more complex, disappointment, perhaps, or recognition of a different kind of betrayal than the one he'd initially assumed. "You really don't know," he said, and it wasn't a question. I shook my head, feeling the ground beneath my feet becoming less solid with each passing second. Everything I thought I understood about my family's financial situation, about the sacrifices my parents had made for my education, about the scholarship applications and college funding, all of it was suddenly suspect. $700,000, Uncle Richard repeated, his voice slightly louder now. "Transferred to a trust account 5 years ago. Specifically designated for your education. With instructions that you should be informed about the funding once you reached your senior year of high school." 5 years ago. When I was 13, just starting high school, just beginning to worry about college costs and future planning. The same period when my parents had started their constant emphasis on our financial limitations, their careful management of information about tuition and scholarships. The mathematics were simple and devastating. While I'd been working part-time jobs and writing scholarship essays about overcoming financial hardship, while my parents had been lamenting our inability to afford better colleges, while I'd been adjusting my dreams downward to match our supposed budget constraints. During all of that time, there had been money. Enough money to pay for any education I could have imagined, sitting in an account I didn't even know existed. "I need to go," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. My parents tried to follow me as I walked toward the parking lot, their explanations becoming more frantic and less coherent with each step. But their words felt meaningless now, noise without substance. The only clear thought in my mind was that everything I'd believed about my life had been constructed on lies, and I needed space to understand what that meant. Uncle Richard caught up with me before I reached my car. "We need to talk," he said. "Soon. But not today. Today was supposed to be about celebrating what you've accomplished." I nodded, though celebration felt impossible now. My accomplishments hadn't disappeared, but they felt different somehow, smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because they'd been built on a foundation of unnecessary struggle, larger because I'd achieved them despite manipulations I hadn't even known existed. The drive home was silent. My parents tried several times to start conversations, but I wasn't ready to hear whatever explanations or justifications they might offer. I needed time to process the magnitude of what I'd learned, to understand how thoroughly my reality had been constructed around information I was never supposed to know. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every conversation about money, every discussion about college funding, every moment when my parents had positioned themselves as struggling heroes of my educational story. The scholarship applications I'd spent months perfecting, the essays about financial hardship I'd crafted with such care, the part-time jobs I'd taken to contribute to my college fund, all of it had been unnecessary theater, performed for an audience that included the very people who could have ended the performance at any time. $700,000. The number felt surreal, but its implications were becoming clearer with each hour that passed. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about the careful construction of a reality designed to serve purposes I was only beginning to understand. The aftermath of graduation day stretched into weeks of careful silence. My parents attempted to return to normal routines, but the elephant in the room had grown too large to ignore. They'd prepare breakfast and comment on the weather, ask about my summer work schedule, and discuss plans for freshman orientation, all while avoiding any mention of the conversation that had shattered our family's carefully maintained fiction. I found myself studying them with new eyes, looking for signs I'd missed, evidence of the deception that had shaped my entire high school experience. The signs had been there all along. I realized subtle inconsistencies that I'd explained away because I trusted the people raising me to tell me the truth about our circumstances. The family vacations we'd taken every summer suddenly looked different in context. Not extravagant, but certainly not the kind of trips families in genuine financial crisis could afford. The home repairs that had appeared to strain our budget but somehow always got completed. The way my parents' stress about money seemed to intensify around college planning seasons, but never extended to genuine panic about basic necessities like housing or food. Most telling was their behavior around paperwork. I'd attributed their careful control over financial documents to protectiveness, but now it seemed more like information management. They'd kept me from seeing the actual numbers involved in college costs, the real terms of financial aid packages, the specific details of scholarship applications and responses. Every barrier they'd erected around financial information suddenly looked calculated rather than caring. The trust account Uncle Richard had mentioned haunted my thoughts. $700,000, designated specifically for my education, with instructions that I should have been informed during my senior year. The timing wasn't coincidental. That was exactly when college decisions needed to be made, when funding sources would become critically important for planning purposes. Instead, I'd spent senior year accepting limitations that didn't exist, adjusting my dreams to match constraints that had been artificially imposed. I'd written scholarship essays about financial hardship while sitting on more educational funding than most students could ever imagine. I'd worked part-time jobs to contribute to college costs that could have been covered entirely by money that was already mine. The manipulation was sophisticated and thorough. My parents had constructed an entire narrative about sacrifice and struggle that served their purposes while keeping me grateful and compliant. They'd positioned themselves as heroes making difficult choices for my benefit, when in reality they'd been intercepting resources intended for me and using my ignorance as cover for their actions. 3 weeks after graduation, I finally confronted them directly. I'd spent enough time processing the initial shock to have clear questions and enough resolve to demand honest answers. I found them in the living room after dinner, watching television with the studied normalcy they'd been maintaining since the graduation ceremony. "We need to talk about the money," I said, making my voice as calm and steady as possible. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. My father reached for the remote and muted the television, while my mother's hands went to her lap in a gesture that looked defensive. They'd been expecting this conversation, preparing for it, but their discomfort was obvious. "Honey," my mother began, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when she wanted to explain something complicated. "There were some misunderstandings at graduation. Uncle Richard was confused about certain arrangements." $700,000, I interrupted. "Uncle Richard was confused about $700,000 that was supposed to be for my education?" My father cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The situation is more complex than it appeared that day. There were family considerations, expenses you don't know about, obligations that had to be met." I waited for more specific explanations, but they seemed to be hoping that vague references to complexity and adult responsibilities would be sufficient. When I didn't respond, my mother tried a different approach. "Everything we did was for the family," she said. "You have your degree, you're ready for the future, and we managed to handle all the complicated financial arrangements without burdening you with adult worries. Isn't that what parents are supposed to do?" The logic was circular and self-serving, designed to reframe theft as protection and deception as care. They wanted credit for shielding me from burdens they'd created by stealing resources that would have eliminated those burdens entirely. "Where did the money go?" I asked. Another exchange of glances, another pause while they calculated how much truth they could avoid sharing. "Home improvements," my father said finally. "Some investments that didn't work out the way we'd hoped. Your mother's medical expenses from a few years ago. Family emergencies that required immediate attention." I remembered my mother's medical issues, a series of tests and treatments that had been concerning, but not catastrophic. Insurance had covered most of the costs, and while there had been some stress about co-pays and deductibles, it hadn't seemed like a financial disaster at the time. "How much of it is left?" I asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. They'd spent money that wasn't theirs, money that had been designated for specific purposes, money that came with clear instructions about disclosure and usage. They'd gambled with my future and lost, then spent years constructing elaborate justifications for their choices. "We can work something out," my mother said, her voice becoming smaller. "Uncle Richard is being unreasonable about this, making it sound worse than it really is. Families help each other." That's what we were doing, helping the family through difficult times. But their definition of family help seemed to flow in only one direction. They'd helped themselves to resources intended for me, helped themselves to decision-making authority that should have been mine, helped themselves to years of gratitude for sacrifices that had never actually been made. "I'm going to tell Uncle Richard everything I know about this," I said. The threat hung in the air like smoke. My parents exchanged another look, this one more desperate than the previous ones. They understood that Uncle Richard's reaction to their deception had been constrained by uncertainty about my involvement. Once he knew I'd been kept in the dark entirely, that I'd been as much a victim of their manipulation as he had been, his response was likely to become much more severe. "You don't understand what that would do to this family," my father said, his voice carrying the first note of real panic I'd heard since graduation day. But I was beginning to understand exactly what it would do to the family. It would force honesty into relationships built on deception. It would hold people accountable for choices they'd made in secret. It would ensure that consequences finally matched actions, even if those consequences were uncomfortable for everyone involved. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to protect them from the results of their own decisions. The family harmony they'd maintained by keeping me ignorant was about to become a casualty of their own choices, and I no longer felt responsible for preserving illusions that had never served my interests. The conversation ended without resolution, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. They could no longer count on my compliance or my gratitude. I'd learned too much to return to the comfortable ignorance that had made their deception possible, and I was no longer willing to prioritize their comfort over my own need for truth. That's where I left it, truth over comfort, and a future I control. If this resonated, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a nudge to set boundaries. Quick questions for you. If $700,000 meant for you went missing, would you pursue legal action or keep it in the family? Have your parents or guardians ever controlled money or info for your own good? What's the hardest boundary you've set with family, and did it stick? Would you rebuild trust with my uncle's approach? Direct support, strict oversight? What would you tell your younger self about money, trust, and transparency?